a valid question to ask, how do you describe suffering? Most of the time, when we think of some question like that, we would go to Job. A testament to the fact that there's a lot of things we don't understand, but God has a handle on everything, and there is a reason for the suffering. But how do you describe suffering? I've often thought it interesting when I've been to doctors on occasion, and perhaps you've had the same experience. You go to the doctor with some ailment, and they sit down with them, and they come in and say, well, how would you define the level of your pain on 1 to 10? And I'm always one to say, well, it's about a 12. Well, I'm here. But that's not really very valid. In fact, one of the things I did ask a doctor is, how do you figure 1 to 10 works? Because I don't know how to tell you in my life what pain is. As I get older, I got pain all the time. I don't know whether any of y'all have arthritis, but it's not fun. Okay? And I don't have it near as bad as some of y'all do. How do you describe that pain? How do you describe suffering? Isaiah 53 is one of those texts that just stands out. One theologian described it, here we seem to have entered the Holy of Holies of Old Testament prophecy. I thought that's very poetic, and it's very apt as we look at a prophecy about Christ. And the interesting thing about Psalm 53, until after the first century or so, Jewish people thought this had a lot to do with the Messiah. Until the pressure of Christianity looked at it as though it had been fulfilled, a specific reference to Christ. And then all of a sudden they decided, no, we can't have that, because of course they didn't believe Jesus was Christ, the Messiah. And so they have a whole different slant on it these days as to what it means. But most all, if not every single Christian theologian that ever has lived, understands Isaiah 53 is the prophecy of what Jesus would go through. And of course, too, when you look at it, there's just so many different references. As Daniel read that, you can remember things that occurred during the crucifixion, during his trial, at his death, even after his death, that are brought out in this text. But what I look at is I ask the question, how do you define suffering? Sometimes I think it's good to reminisce, to remember what it is that Jesus has done for us. If you look at chapter 52 and begin with me, the response in chapter 53 verse 1 is a response to these three texts here, or these three verses here. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. And just as many as were astonished at you, so his vision was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. He shall sprinkle many nations, kings shall shut their mouths at him, for what had not been told them they shall see, and what they have not heard they shall consider. One of the reasons in the first few verses of chapter 53 is the question is asked, who's going to believe this report? Who would believe that somebody is coming from God who is going to be a Messiah and save the world? How would you envision him? How would you picture him in your mind? What kind of person would he be? Well, in the first place, he would be like Saul, 6 foot something. He would be a good-looking fellow like David. He would be somebody that we could, let me just put it in our cultural acumen, he'd be a Hollywood actor. He would be famous for what he looks like and what he portrays. And Jesus was anything but that. He did not fit the form that was expected of someone who was going to lead a band of people to their reclamation of their whole nation, and they were going to be back where they used to be, number one in the world, with this massive, powerful king that sat on a throne on earthly Canaan and reclaim everything the Jews had lost. Why, you needed a warrior like Joshua or something on that line. Jesus was nothing like that. He was not believable as a Messiah. So we find this, who's going to believe our report? Well, nobody's going to believe a report when you talk about a guy that's going to be a Messiah. And this is not at all what we expected. You know, we act surprised sometimes when we look at the Jewish people in the culture of their time when Jesus came and wonder, how in the world could anybody watch a guy put a leg back on a fellow, cause a blind man to jump up and do flips, cause a not a blind man, cause a blind man to see, cause a lame man to jump up and do flips. How can you see that and still deny who Jesus was? But you got to look at what they were expecting. And it's amazing to me how expectations can rule the day. Sometimes, and I've seen this a lot in marriages. In fact, one of the lines I use when I do marriage ceremonies, I used to do them. Don't do them much anymore, but anyway, I used to do them, and I'd say, one of the problems with newlyweds is expectations. And I would look at the guy and say, this gal's real pretty, but she ain't Cinderella. And I'd look over to the girl and say, he's no prince. Because expectations will kill you. Because what we've already got in our mind is the way it's got to be. Naaman was brought to his knees by the fact that somebody told him, go wash in the dirty Jordan 7 times. Thankfully, he had a wise young Jewish lady with him at the time, or wise servants around him at the time who would tell him about this prophet over there who could cure him of his leprosy and tell him, hey, if he told you something hard to do, wouldn't you do it? And when Naaman went and washed and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, he rose up clean. Expectations sometimes will ruin us, and we're looking at that very thing. For the longest time, Jewish prophets all looked at this text here and said, oh, that's got to be the Messiah, until he came, and he wasn't what they expected. And this teaches us that's exactly what happened. He was rejected by his own. And not only that, he came to do something that no one else could do, and that is make an account for the sins we've committed. I like the verse in verse 6. I like the way it's stated. We are like sheep who have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. Well, that's what sin is. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's a fact. That's a fact. Romans 3:23. And so that being the case, there is a comparison made to sheep who have gone astray. I don't know whether you're familiar with sheep. We have some Barbados sheep, and I'm here to tell you for a fact, Barbados sheep are not smart. I'm just saying, goats are bad enough. There's not a fence around that'll keep a goat in. You can throw water through a fence, a goat can get out of that. But sheep are not smart. But one thing they do is they hang together. And what happens is when one goes astray, they panic because they're not around anybody else, and they do the dumbest things, trying to get back to the crowd. We are like that. We're like sheep going astray. And sometimes we're not smart. In fact, I would say sin is dumb. Okay, I'll just say it right out. Sin is not smart. It is that thing that you do that, number one, you think you can get away with it. Number two, you think it's going to be pleasurable, which it is for a little while, and then it gets hurtful, and then you have regrets, and then you have problems dealing with the sin itself, which comes down to the bottom line. You can't really deal with it on your own. You have to have Christ to deal with it, and that's why he came. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We've sang many, many psalms at our worship assembly about how we have been healed by his stripes. Yeah, he came here not to set up a physical earthly kingdom, but he came here to fix our souls. How do you define suffering? Maybe for a good man, somebody give up his life, but Jesus, while we were yet sinners, gave himself. I sometimes have to read this when I'm dealing with people. And you know how people can be. I say that like I need to spit it out in my mouth. But people can try to test you sometimes. And then I look back at this and I think of myself and what Jesus did for me. And I am humbled. And I'm ashamed that I have thought this about somebody I know, somebody I care about, somebody I may love. And I'm getting impatient with them. How dare I? When Jesus, while I was still a sinner, came to this earth and died for me. I can't speak for you, but I wasn't worth it. Don't know what he saw in me that he would die for me. And while it was not just for me, it was the whole world he came for. I take it personal because I'm part of that whole world. He died for me. How do you define suffering? Have you ever tried to help somebody where they won't help themselves? Or they just can't figure out a way and you don't know what you could possibly do to help them? It is so frustrating. And And yet Jesus came while we were still sinners, and he died for us. And look what he went through. The shame publicly. The idea of being crucified, that's the worst death you can die in the Roman era. I'm telling you, it was horrible. And then between two sinners, all the people down there mocking him that could see him and look up at him. The two guys on the cross even mocking him. The things he went through. Why? Because he loved you and I. How do you define suffering? How hard it must be to do for those who are hard to do for. And yet that's what we ought to do if we're going to imitate Christ. Why would he do this? Well, in verse 10 we're told. By the way, I am not doing justice to this passage. I've read enough this week about this particular chapter that I can tell you for a fact it goes so deep, and there are so many facets to it. There are so many ways in which you can look at this chapter. I'm scratching the surface, folks. But if I can bring to your mind the idea that sometimes as we get discouraged and we think we're suffering, wait a minute. Don't be a high-maintenance Christian. Don't be thinking all the time about ourselves, because it's easy to do that, especially when you're in pain. And yet Jesus from the cross would look down and tell people, or speak to God saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You know, it pleased, in verse 10, it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. It reminds me of a reading back in Acts, the 8th chapter. And the reason I go there is because when I get done looking at this entire chapter, and I see what the suffering was that Jesus went through, my question becomes, how do I respond? How should I look at Isaiah 53? How should I change my way of looking at life and my way of considering my brethren and how I respond to them? And I'll look at a fellow that's traveling along, having come from Jerusalem. Pick up the reading in chapter 8 of Acts, verse 26. Now an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, Arise and go toward the south along the road which goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is desert. So he arose and he went. Behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of her treasury and had come to Jerusalem to worship. Probably a proselyte, more or less, but a Jewish fellow, more or less. And was returning, and sitting in his chariot, he was reading Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit said to Philip, Go near and overtake his chariot. So Philip ran to him, heard him reading from the prophet Isaiah, and said, Do you understand what you are reading? And he said, How can I unless someone guides me? And he asked Philip to come up and sit with him, and he started. The place in the scripture which he had read was this: he was a lamb, he was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. His humiliation, his judgment was taken from him. And who will declare his generation? For his life was taken from the earth. So the eunuch answered Philip, said, I ask you, of whom does this prophet say this? Of himself or some other man? And Philip opened his mouth and began at this scripture, the one we just read, Isaiah 53, and said, he preached to him Jesus. How do you describe, how do you define, how do you flesh out suffering? This guy was reading this, and it made an impact on him, and he was reading it as though, you know, I got to know who this fella is. Who was this talking about? And Philip explained, it's Jesus. Now, what's the response we should have to Isaiah 53? Well, I would believe that this is the response we ought to have. As we went down the road and came to some water, the eunuch said, here's water. What hinders me from being baptized? That's how we ought to respond in our thanksgiving and in our gratitude to who Jesus is and what he suffered for you and I. Yes, he died for the whole world, but personalize it for just a moment. He died for you. All your imperfections, with all the warts, he loves you. And he died for you. How do you respond? There's a million reasons, and there's a million religions in America today who would give you reasons why you don't need to be baptized. Or you just get wet in water for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. That's not the case here. If you understand who Jesus is, they came across some water. Philip says, here's water, what hinders me? And he said, well, there is some things that can hinder you. One of the ones listed here is what he told this Ethiopian, that you've got to believe with all your heart that Jesus is who he said he was. And therefore he said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that's unfortunate that some translations decide that because of the manuscript evidence, which is not in particular manuscripts, it's in tons of them, but just particular ones that they rate higher than others. This doesn't belong here, but it is hardly ever that you will find a question asked in the Bible that's not answered. Okay? And so the question is asked in verse 36, and verse 37 is the response here of what's going to happen. And so he commanded the chariot to stand still, and both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and he baptized him. If you want to be saved, if you want to be right with God, if you want to say thank you to Jesus for all of the suffering he went through, then you respond. Now, most everybody here this evening is a member of the Lord's church. If you're not, we invite you to be baptized into Christ. But if you are, the response doesn't end just with this. It is a response that is continuous because of the reminder of who Jesus is and what he did and the suffering he went through for you and I, so that we can have hope in eternal life. I would encourage you, if your life's not right with God, to get it right with God and respond to the song we sing as an invitation to you to come. Won't you do so? Stand together.